My name is Mia Whitmore. I'm 25 years old. And I've spent most of my life existing on the edges of my own family's spotlight. I was the daughter no one talked about unless someone needed something done quiet. Dependable. And invisible in a house, obsessed with my younger brother Logan's every breath. When our grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, passed away, my mother wept more for the press than for the woman she hadn't visited in 4 years. Logan flew in late, made a dramatic entrance, and asked where the cameras were. I stood in the shadows at the edge of the service, numb but oddly alert. It felt less like mourning and more like watching a transaction unfold. One where I already knew I didn't have a seat at the table. That assumption shattered minutes later. After the burial, a sharply dressed woman in her late 50s approached me. "Miss Whitmore," she asked, pressing a sealed envelope into my hand. "Your grandmother left instructions. For you only." I took it cautiously, half expecting it to be a final guilt trip or a relic meant for Logan. Instead, the moment I opened it, my entire reality shifted. Inside was a handwritten letter, full of Margaret's elegant, slanted script. "You are the only one who ever listened. Whoever looked me in the eye and asked how I was doing. I've built something most will never understand. And I've left it all to you. But not for show. Watch first. Let them reveal themselves." Folded beneath it was a second document, cold, stamped, notarized proof that I, Mia Whitmore, was now the sole heir to the entire Whitmore estate. Real estate. Investment portfolios. Silent shares in companies I didn't even know she owned. It added up to nearly $36 million. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat in my car in the church parking lot. Air conditioning, humming. Hands trembling around the edges of that folder. Then I laughed, a short, sharp, bewildered sound that filled the space like a question I didn't know how to answer. Not joy. Not even shock. Just the sound of something breaking loose inside me. Something that had been buried since I was old enough to understand I was always going to be second. Always the plan B. The backup. The one who knew how to disappear. I drove back to Boston that night with the envelope still on the passenger seat beside me. The city lights looked different. Colder. Sharper. As if they were all watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. What I did was simple. I said nothing. I returned to the same life I'd been living, my quiet bookstore job in Beacon Hill. My one-bedroom apartment. My routine walks to the local cafe. But behind the scenes, I activated everything Grandma had left. I met with her lawyers under aliases. I built a private trust, WCO, to quietly manage her assets. I brought in advisors, auditors, and began to understand exactly how far her investments reached. She'd been underestimated, too. Just like me. She knew what it meant to be surrounded by people who only wanted you when you were useful. And she'd spent 30 years building an empire in the shadows. Now that empire was mine. Meanwhile, my mother called me once a week, not to ask how I was doing, but to give Logan updates. He's pitching again next week. Big investors. It's his time. Mia. We're all so proud. I would smile into the phone. That's great, Mom. I didn't remind her that Logan had burned through hundreds of thousands in failed ventures. That his college friend had once taken the fall for an idea Logan had plagiarized. That he had charisma and no compass. I didn't say a word. I just listened. And with each call, I became more certain my silence was the sharpest weapon I had. 3 weeks later, I quietly acquired 82% of the mortgage company that owned the deed to my parents' mansion in Newton. Then I bought the silent majority share in the fintech firm Logan was chasing for funding. I became a ghost investor in the wellness company my mother promoted at charity events. None of them knew. Because to them, I was still Mia the sweet, unambitious girl in flats and cardigans, reading poetry, waiting to get married or teach kindergarten. The longer I stayed quiet, the more I saw. Rick, my stepfather, had taken out 2 lines of credit to keep up with Logan's image. My mother dipped into Margaret's memorial fund to pay for a new car. Logan lived off borrowed money and bluffed meetings he never secured. And through it all, no one once asked me how I was doing. Not once. But I watched. I waited. And then I saw my moment coming. Something was about to crack, and I would be the one holding the hammer. The tipping point came faster than I expected. It started with a voicemail from my mother, barely masked in panic. "Mia. Honey. We just need a little help. Just a small loan. Logan's pitch didn't go as planned. And the water heater just exploded." She laughed nervously, like it was a sitcom mishap. "You're always so careful with your money." Careful, I could have bought that entire house in cash and still had enough left to fund Logan's ego for the next 5 years. But I kept the act. "I can send a few hundred." I texted back. "But things are tight here too." I could almost hear the silence that followed on her end, sharp and cold, like someone realizing the piggy bank was empty. The truth was, I'd already made the decision. Weeks prior, I'd quietly purchased the delinquent mortgage on their Newton mansion through an LLC named Willow & Capital, a company with no visible ties to me. The moment they defaulted again, and they would, I'd be able to pull the house out from under them like a magician, revealing the final card. But the house wasn't the point. The house was just the symbol. What I wanted was the look on their faces when they realized the person they'd treated like a footnote had been writing the whole script all along. Logan, for his part, continued his charade. He came by the bookstore one Friday afternoon, suede jacket, 2 tight jeans, and sunglasses inside. As always, still playing cashier, he smirked. "You know, Mia, you should really consider working for me. I could use someone to fetch coffee. You'd be great at that." I smiled. "And you'd be great at paying your investors back." He blinked. Just for a moment. Then he laughed. Loud and hollow. And changed the subject. But that flicker, that tiny glitch in his confidence was everything. He was bleeding behind the performance. And he didn't even know I had front row seats. That week, I signed off on 2 loan denials. One from a firm funding seed-stage tech ventures. Another from a private banking group Logan had submitted a pitch deck to. Both under umbrellas I controlled. I was no longer just waiting. I was steering. My mother called again. "We're thinking of selling the lake house," she said. Voice tight. "Just for liquidity." I almost admired her. Karen Whitmore was nothing if not theatrical. Her version of liquidity meant draining every drop of comfort before she admitted she'd run dry. I knew the lake house had sentimental value. It was where she and Rick renewed their vows, where Logan had thrown his infamous graduation party, where they banned me from inviting friends because I was too quiet. And it would be awkward. So I did what I knew would sting most. I bought the property through a realty shell company, paid cash. And when she tried to sell, the broker politely informed her the land had already changed hands. That night, she left a voicemail this time. No laughter. Just silence. Then, softly, "You don't even care, Do you? I replayed that line 4 times. What did she mean, care about what? The family who left me scraping through community college alone while they funded Logan's tuition and 3 gap years in Europe. The mother who said, "It's not that we don't love you, Mia. It's just that Logan needs more support right now." For a decade. But part of me did care. That was the worst of it. I wasn't doing this for greed or vengeance. I was doing it because I wanted them to feel what it was like to be dismissed. Neglected. Discarded like the spare button on a designer coat. And I wanted to do it without raising my voice once. The final fracture came in the form of a family dinner. Rick invited me. Almost as an afterthought. Logan's launching his beta next week. We're celebrating. You coming or not? The tone wasn't hostile, just assumptive. Like I was the unpaid intern expected to clap for the CEO. I went. I wore a simple black dress. Hair down. No makeup. No jewelry. They needed to believe I was still the same. The moment I walked in, I knew something had shifted. The house was colder. Literally, they'd cut heating hours to save costs. Logan was nursing a half-empty glass of scotch he clearly couldn't afford. My mother wore last season's heels. And Rick, he tried to keep it together. But I saw it in the way his eyes twitched when the server asked if the card on file still worked. They were unraveling. And then Logan made the toast. To rising again, he said, lifting his glass. Because some people in this family don't know what it means to bet on greatness. He looked at me. I held his gaze and clinked my water glass. Later that night, I slipped a letter into Rick's office drawer. It was a foreclosure notice from Willow and Capital. They had 30 days. No signature. No trace. Just a date. Bolded. They wouldn't connect the dots. Not yet. But soon, the clock would run out. And when it did, they'd come begging for answers. For blame. For help. And I'd be there. Perfectly composed. Holding every card they thought I'd never touch. They say power is best wielded silently. I never truly understood that until the day my family began knocking on doors they didn't know I already owned. By the 3rd week of January, the Whitmore residence, once the gleaming symbol of their upper-middle-class superiority, was teetering on the edge of foreclosure. My parents, still performing the illusion of control, tried to refinance again. Denied. Rick even reached out to a few of his old golf buddies for bridge financing. That door was also shut politely. Coldly. I'd made sure of it. Meanwhile, Logan had launched his revolutionary app. It crashed within 2 days. Reviews on beta sites ripped it apart for bugs, data leakage, and lack of direction. He called it sabotage. I called it karma. The startup's burn rate was astronomical. And thanks to the invisible hand of W.Co., no institutional investor would touch him. I'd blocked funding from 3 angles: tech incubators, seed capital firms, and even the alumni network he'd been tapping. He never stood a chance. Then came the dinner. Karen invited me again. This time, with a voice trembling between desperation and forced warmth. Just come home, Mia. It's been a rough season. I agreed. Because by then, I needed to see their eyes when the mask fully cracked. The dining room was dimmer than usual. The chandelier missing 3 bulbs. Logan was quieter. More twitchy. Karen poured boxed wine into her usual stemware like it was vintage. Rick chewed slower. It was no longer about hiding the fall, it was about pretending they hadn't already hit the ground. Mid-meal, Logan slammed his glass down. So tell me, Mia, he said, through clenched teeth. How the hell is it that everyone I know has suddenly ghosted me? He didn't wait for a response. People I've worked with for years won't take my calls. Even Terry from Avalon dropped out of the funding round. Terry. He owed me. I sipped my water. Maybe they're busy. Karen reached across the table. Mia. If you know anything about what's going on in these circles, your brother needs a win right now. It was the first time in over a decade that she'd said your brother like he and I existed on the same level. I almost smiled. I didn't tell them I'd purchased Terry's debt 6 months ago and offered him quiet legal immunity in exchange for severing ties with Logan. I didn't say I'd personally restructured Avalon's investment priorities so that Logan's sector was now non-strategic. I just offered a neutral nod. The way a nurse might look at a patient about to realize their diagnosis. 2 nights later, I received an email from Rick. Subject line: help. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. He said he was sorry. That he didn't know things were this bad. That he should have been more present. That if there was anything I could do, anything I should consider doing it for the sake of the family name. I forwarded it to my private archivist. Then I went to bed. Because something was finally happening, they were starting to crack. But not because I was punishing them. Because they were finally seeing me. The next morning, I signed the final document, a quiet transfer of full ownership of the Newton house from Willowwind Capital into my name. Eviction papers were prepared. Not delivered yet. I gave them 7 days. But something unexpected happened on the 6th. Karen showed up. At my apartment. She looked thinner. Hollowed. Like life had been scraped off her skin layer by layer. She held a tin of cookies store-bought. Unopened, and her smile was brittle. I just wanted to see you, she said. I was in the area. I let her in. She sat gingerly. Like the couch might collapse under the weight of her shame. I've been thinking, she said after a long silence, about how we treated you. About the things I said. The way I always assumed you'd just be there. I said nothing. Because what could I say that wouldn't sound rehearsed? I don't want your money, she continued. I know we screwed up. Her voice caught. You were never supposed to be the enemy. Enemy. That word lodged in my chest, like a key turned halfway in a locked door. For a moment, I wondered if she was sincere. If the woman who had once told me I was just too serious to be lovable was now seeing the full outline of her own neglect. But then she said it. If we lose the house, we lose everything. Your brother is already humiliated. Rick's not sleeping. We need a lifeline. And there it was. Not an apology. A negotiation. I stood. I can't fix Logan's ego. Or your mortgage. Or the fact that I spent 20 years being wallpaper in my own family. She blinked. Then why did you build all this? Mia. Just to gloat. I laughed. Quiet. Measured. No. I built it because no one else would have believed I could. Not even you. I walked her to the door. She looked back once. Just before stepping into the hallway. There was something in her eyes, shame. Maybe. Or regret. But I didn't chase it. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I doubted myself, but because for the first time, the chessboard felt too still. Like I was winning too cleanly. And in my gut, I knew they wouldn't just collapse. People like Karen. Like Logan. Like Rick, they don't go quietly. They pivot. They scheme. And sometimes, They strike back. I should have known they wouldn't take defeat lying down. That wasn't the Whitmore way. Humiliation only fueled their delusions. Losing control didn't inspire humility, it inspired retaliation. So when Logan's LinkedIn mysteriously updated to reflect a new stealth mode tech startup, I knew the storm hadn't passed. It was circling back. The next hit didn't come from them directly. It came from within my circle. Jeremy, my attorney of 6 years. Someone who'd helped me structure every shell. Every blind trust. Every quiet acquisition suddenly requested an urgent in-person meeting. I arrived at the coffee shop early. He looked nervous, sweating through his collar. "I got a call," he said, skipping formalities. "From a law firm. Kessler, Hale. They're asking about your stake in Willowwind Capital." They knew names, deal numbers, tax structures. Someone's digging. Mia. Deep. I didn't react. Outwardly, internally. Adrenaline surged like fire. I asked one question. Did they mention Logan? Jeremy paused. No. But they did ask if you'd ever managed properties tied to family. So it had begun. They were fishing. But they were close. Someone, somehow, had found a thread. I thanked Jeremy, paid for his espresso, and walked out with a smile that didn't touch my eyes. By nightfall, I had already taken 3 defensive actions. I locked down digital trails, changed financial custodians, shifted property control back into overseas entities. This wasn't panic. This was protocol. You don't build a hidden empire without expecting someone to eventually look under the floorboards. Then I received the second strike letter. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a photo. Me. At my bookstore. Smiling. With a yellow sticky note on the back that read, "You built all this to be alone." My blood ran cold not because I feared exposure, but because I recognized the handwriting. It was Logan's. What terrified me wasn't the message, it was that he'd found a way to get close. Quietly. That while I was playing chess. He'd slithered into checkers. He wasn't trying to reclaim what he lost. He was trying to infect what I'd built. The next morning, I called Aiden. He was the closest thing I had to a real friend. A forensic accountant I'd met at a corporate ethics seminar. Brilliant, sarcastic, and entirely uninterested in anyone's approval. I trusted him because he never once asked about my past. He just looked at numbers like maps and found patterns everyone else missed. "I need you to trace back 2 years of communication," I told him. Bank transactions, email pings, IP lookups tied to anything with Logan's footprint. "I think he's trying to unravel something." Aiden didn't ask why. He just said, "Give me 48 hours. That night, I barely slept. I kept staring at the sticky note, wondering if Logan was bluffing or if he was finally doing what Whitmores always did best: manipulate sentiment to regain power. The blow came faster than expected. 2 days later, I woke to news articles flooding my feed. Tech heiress silent partner in housing scam did former bookstore owner evict her own family. The headlines were vague, speculative but venomous. The photo, a cropped image of me and Karen. Years ago. Arms awkwardly linked. Suddenly, my anonymity was bleeding under the spotlight. My bookstore saw a wave of online hate. Trust fund parasite. You pretended to be humble. How many people did you throw out to get rich? The damage wasn't complete, but it had begun. And I knew exactly who planted the seeds. Logan. He didn't care about money anymore. This was about poisoning my reputation. He couldn't win his game. So, he broke into mine. But what he didn't know was that I had one final piece left to play. And it wasn't just mine, it belonged to Margaret Whitmore. The woman they'd all buried without a second thought. I went into her study, the room I hadn't entered since inheriting her estate. I unlocked the fireproof drawer only I had access to. Inside was a USB drive. Labeled, in her elegant cursive, redemption or ruin. It contained letters, legal recordings, a full deposition Margaret had given to a private notary before she passed. She detailed everything: how Karen had forged her signature to redirect funds into Rick's dying hedge fund, how Logan had used family contacts to swindle elderly investors in his college venture, how they'd cut me out of inheritance conversations because, quote, Mia won't do anything with it anyway. And the last line of the final recording: if she ever needs to defend herself, this is her sword. My hands trembled. For the first time since I began this campaign, I felt something stronger than strategy. I felt fury. Not because they were trying to ruin me, but because even from the grave, Margaret knew this day would come. She knew they'd try to devour me if they ever sensed I had the upper hand. I sent a private message to 3 journalists. Attached the files. No explanation. Just one line. You were right to question the story. Here's the truth. But I didn't stop there. I called a press conference. No advisors. No legal team. Just me. In a tailored charcoal suit. Standing behind a podium in front of the bookstore. Cameras flashed. Microphones buzzed. And I spoke. I am Mia Whitmore. I inherited nothing but silence. I built everything I have alone. And I've never evicted anyone who didn't sign their own fate first. I paused. Let the tension settle like dust. But if the world wants to know who the Whitmores really are, ask them why they needed to destroy their daughter to feel powerful again. The silence that followed was deafening. The war had gone public. And now, no one was hiding anymore. The fallout from my press conference was instantaneous and brutal. The media frenzy exploded overnight, shifting the narrative from quiet suspicion to full-blown scandal. My family's skeletons were no longer whispers behind closed doors, they were headlines splashed across every news outlet, dissected and debated in talk shows and social media alike. Logan's smirks turned into desperate silence. Karen's polished mask cracked into fractures I had never dared to hope for. Yet amid the chaos, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I was not running, hiding, or fighting shadows. I was standing in the light, owning my story on my terms. The fight wasn't just for money or vindication anymore. It was about reclaiming my identity, my dignity, and, in the process, breaking the cycle that had haunted our family for generations. Days later, as the dust settled, I received an unexpected call from Aunt Patty. Her voice was cautious but different no longer. Syrupy concern, but a fragile attempt at reconciliation. Mia, I saw the news. It's a lot. I just want you to know. I never wanted things to come to this. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Neither did I. I said quietly, but sometimes, the truth has no other way out. She paused, then whispered, maybe it's time for all of us to face it. To change. That conversation was the first real thread of hope I'd felt in years. Not that it would undo the past, but that perhaps there was a future where we could all live honestly, separately. Perhaps, but with a shred of peace. The legal aftermath was swift and decisive. With the evidence Margaret had left and the public eye trained on them, the Harrisons had no choice but to settle their debts and begin rebuilding from scratch. The bankruptcy court approved my restructuring plan, and I watched as my family was forced to confront the consequences of decades of denial and fantasy. Karen found work as a floral arranger in a small shop. Rick took a night security job. And Logan, once the golden child, accepted a modest position at a local pet store. His dreams of tech stardom shelved indefinitely. Watching them rebuild was bittersweet. Their forced humility was a justice long overdue. But I also saw the weight of their failure, the shame that no amount of money could erase. Yet, for all the resentment I harbored, I knew deep down this was a new beginning for all of us. Even if it wasn't the one I had originally envisioned. One quiet afternoon, back in my bookstore, I found myself leafing through Margaret's old journal again. Her handwriting, fading but resolute, reminded me of the legacy she had entrusted to me, not just wealth, but wisdom, strength, and the courage to choose truth over comfort. Her words echoed in my mind. Better to stand alone with the truth than to be surrounded by lies. I looked around the shop, the scent of old paper, the quiet hum of a community that had embraced me not for my money but for who I was. This was my true inheritance. The empire wasn't built from real estate or stocks, it was built from resilience, integrity, and the ability to carve a life worth living out of the wreckage. Yet, even as peace settled, the past never fully let go. One evening, as I was closing up, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You did what you had to do. But remember, every sword cuts both ways. A chill ran down my spine. The war was over, but the story that was still unfolding. And in that moment, I understood something. Essential power without purpose is hollow. Revenge without reflection is merely another kind of cage. I had inherited money. Yes. But more importantly, I had inherited a choice, the choice to be better, to be whole, and to write the next chapter on my own terms. This was not just the end of a family drama. It was the beginning of a new legacy. Thank you for listening. Now, what would you do if you held the sword? Would you wield it for destruction? Or would you carve a new path to freedom? Life after the storm was quieter, but not simpler. The courtroom battles and public humiliation had stripped my family down to their barest truths. For me, the weight of responsibility shifted from confrontation to careful stewardship, guarding not just the wealth, but the legacy of truth and justice my grandmother had entrusted me. But peace, as I soon learned, is never a permanent state. It's a fragile pause between battles. I threw myself into growing the bookstore and the literacy program we had started. The shop became my sanctuary, a place where stories breathed life, where I could connect with people on something deeper than money or betrayal. Each customer who walked in, from curious teens to lifelong bibliophiles, reminded me that life was about stories, about connection, and about second chances. And yet, as the years passed, I sensed a subtle shift not in the outside world, but within the walls of my family's shattered home. Rick had adapted with grudging pragmatism. His once arrogant swagger was replaced by a cautious, almost haunted gait. Karen, once the proud social climber, found solace in small victories, arranging flowers, organizing community events, reclaiming fragments of dignity lost in the financial collapse. Logan was perhaps the hardest to watch. His youthful arrogance had been replaced by a slow, grinding resentment, tempered with reluctant acceptance. I tried to reach out letters, Occasional phone calls, but the walls they had built around themselves were thick and impenetrable. Their silence was louder than any accusation. Yet, every so often, a glimpse of vulnerability would break through. A message left on voicemail. A chance encounter at a local store. A lingering look that said more than words ever could. We were all prisoners of our past, bound by pain and regret, searching for a way forward that didn't yet exist. One afternoon, while closing up the bookstore, Maria stopped by with a peculiar look on her face. "Mia, there's someone here to see you," she said, eyes wide with surprise. "Says it's urgent." My heart skipped. It wasn't anyone from my past who usually showed up unannounced. I nodded and braced myself. Standing in the doorway was a man I hadn't seen in years. Frank Miller. His weathered face held the same quiet dignity I remembered, though the lines of hardship were deeper now. "Mia," he said, simply. "I wanted to thank you for what you did with the debt. You gave me a chance when no one else would." I invited him in, and as we sat, surrounded by towers of books, he shared how his hardware store, once on the brink of collapse, had slowly started to recover. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "But your plan gave me hope. I'm rebuilding. Not just the store, but my family's future." Hearing those words, a warmth blossomed inside me, mingling relief with a quiet pride. The justice I had sought wasn't just about punishing wrongs, it was about creating space for healing. But beneath that hope lurked a question I couldn't shake: could my family find that same redemption? The seasons turned. New chapters unfolded. Some hopeful, some painful. My financial oversight remained vigilant, ensuring no return to the old patterns of recklessness. I found myself mentoring young entrepreneurs, using lessons learned from our family saga to guide others away from the pitfalls of entitlement and denial. Each success story was a balm for wounds that still throbbed beneath the surface. But shadows lingered. One evening, as I was closing the shop, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Legacy isn't just what you build. It's what you choose to leave behind. Watch your back." The message was brief, cold, and unmistakably a warning. The past wasn't finished with me. That night, sleep was elusive. My mind raced through every possibility. Had someone from my family's old circle, friends, foes, or even allies, felt threatened by the upheaval? Was this a ghost from Margaret's past, or a new adversary testing my resolve? I realized then that inheriting the empire was only the beginning. Maintaining it required more than legal acumen or financial savvy. It demanded vigilance, courage, and an unflinching willingness to confront whatever new battles lay ahead. The next morning, I met with Chun at the bookstore. Over steaming cups of coffee, we strategized not just about finances, but about securing the legacy on all fronts. David's calm confidence was a steady anchor. "Mia," he said, "power attracts challenges, but you've already proven you have what it takes." His words steadied me, but the unspoken truth lingered. This was a lifelong path, fraught with dangers unseen and trials unimagined. I would have to evolve constantly, sharpen my sword, and protect not only what I'd inherited but what I hoped to build. As the sun streamed through the bookstore's dusty windows, illuminating the countless stories lining the shelves, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My story was far from over. The next chapters, yet unwritten, held promises and perils alike. Would I be the architect of healing, or the wielder of destruction? The choice was mine. Now more than ever. And with every breath, I prepared to write the legacy. I had always deserved a legacy, forged not from wealth alone, but from truth, resilience, and uncompromising courage. The sword was in my hand. The future awaited. And whatever came next, I was ready. Story 2. My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old. Living in Chicago. Working as a financial analyst, steady, reliable, nothing glamorous. For years, I played a silent role in my family's life. The invisible safety net no one ever thanked. I paid their bills, handled emergencies, covered their debts, and quietly kept the household afloat. No applause, no acknowledgement, just an expectation that I would always be there, ready to fix whatever broke. 2 months ago, the family announced a big celebration for my grandparents' 75th anniversary. 75 years, that should have been a moment of joy for all of us. A chance to come together, share laughter and memories. But from the start, something felt off. My mother called me a few weeks prior, asking for help. We're a little short on funds, she said. Voice casual but with an undertone I couldn't ignore. Anything you can do would mean a lot. I hesitated but agreed to contribute $1,000, the maximum I could spare without stretching myself too thin. I sent it with a note, contribution for grandparents' party. That was the extent of my involvement. Or so I thought. The night of the party. The grandeur of the banquet hall was overwhelming. 75 guests. A live jazz trio. Elegant table settings. I had hoped to feel a part of the celebration. To hear a kind word. To share a moment of belonging. Instead, I was seated at the kids' table. Not as a joke or oversight, my name was literally on a card among preteens. Next to an 11-year-old cousin glued to his tablet. My siblings. Cousins. Even the youngest adult relative had seats at the main table with parents and elders. But me, a plastic cup, a folding chair, and silence. I smiled politely when a child asked if I liked chicken nuggets. I watched from the sidelines as my mother laughed and chatted with her sister at the head table, not sparing me a glance beyond a tight, rehearsed smile. No hug. No warm welcome. Just an invisible barrier between me and everyone else. The sting wasn't in the food or the seating arrangement, it was in the message. I wasn't family enough to belong with the grown-ups. But apparently, I was family enough to foot a massive bill. Then, just as people began to rise for dancing, the event manager approached. She looked me in the eye and said, "Hey, you're covering the $3,600 balance." Right, I froze. The weight of that question was heavier than the silence that followed. I nodded toward the head table and said, "Ask the grown-ups." She turned away. And I finished my drink quietly. I left soon after. The evening was over for me. But the fallout was just beginning. The next morning, my phone exploded with calls and messages from my mother, my aunt, and even some cousins. Anger, confusion, accusations. They were furious. I hadn't paid the full amount. My mother insisted it was covered. But the event manager had the contract, listing me as the responsible party for the remaining balance. I had never agreed to that. Not in words. Not in writing. Not ever. My mother had given my name without my knowledge. And when I didn't pay, she scrambled to cover the cost herself right there at the party. In front of everyone. I listened to their outrage. their desperate attempts to spin the story in their favor. I was the villain. The one who bailed. Who embarrassed the family. Who ruined the celebration. But beneath their words, I heard something else: betrayal. They used me as a safety net, but never once truly saw me as family. I had been quiet for so long. But now, I realized silence was complicity. I wasn't going to be the invisible scapegoat anymore. That same day, a cousin I barely knew reached out with an unexpected message. Danielle told me her husband had accidentally recorded a private conversation at the party. My mother, my aunt, they laughed about how I never stand up for myself. How I'd just pay up without a fight. Hearing their contempt being reduced to a punchline and an ATM stung deeper than I could say. I didn't want revenge. I wanted boundaries. I wanted respect. So I sent a clear message to my entire family. Laying down firm financial boundaries. Attaching proof of my limits. And warning that any attempt to pin expenses on me without consent would have legal consequences. The reaction was swift and severe. My mother's voice messages dripped with fake hurt. My aunt called me vindictive. Some cousins sided with me, others stayed silent. But something inside me had changed. I was done hiding. Done covering for their messes without recognition. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about reclaiming my dignity. And this was only the beginning. After sending that message, I thought the storm would pass quickly. But it only grew fiercer. My phone buzzed nonstop: calls, texts, emails, all from family members trying to draw me back into the chaos. But I didn't answer. Instead, I found solace in silence. Something I hadn't known for years. The absence of their demands. The freedom from their expectations. Felt strange but liberating. Yet the fallout wasn't just digital. The party's aftermath echoed in real life. Gossip spread like wildfire through family groups. I heard whispers during family gatherings that weren't about shared memories, but about me, the selfish one. The ungrateful. The troublemaker. It was exhausting. But the truth was even more exhausting. I'd been carrying the weight of their lives for years while they dismissed me as a burden when I asked for nothing but respect. One evening, Danielle, my cousin who had sent me the recording, called. Her voice was soft but urgent. She said she'd been watching quietly, waiting for the right moment. And she wanted me to know I wasn't alone. Hearing that made me realize I'd underestimated the cracks in the family facade. Some people were just as tired as I was. Trapped by expectations and silence. It was around then I made another decision. Not only was I going to set boundaries financially, but I needed space, physical and emotional. I changed the locks on my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. For years, my siblings had treated it like a drop-in hotel. I'd never complained. Now, that room was mine alone again. I unfollowed my family on social media, removed myself from their group chats, even disabled location sharing on family apps. It wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's calls stopped. My siblings didn't show up unannounced. The house I'd grown up in suddenly felt empty. But for once, it wasn't suffocating. It was healing. Still, the financial mess lingered. I had uncovered months of unpaid bills, ignored maintenance, and mounting debts that my family had ignored while relying on me to bail them out. My sister, who had always been the successful one, suddenly had no safety net. My parents, proud and stubborn, refused to ask for help. It was a silent unraveling. One night, my mother showed up at my door unexpectedly. She looked older, Wearier. No accusations. No anger, just a quiet plea for a conversation. I let her in but didn't say much. She spoke of how hard things had become. How she'd been too proud to ask. How the family was falling apart. Her words weren't apologies. But they were the first crack in the wall. That night, I realized forgiveness wouldn't be easy. Nor immediate. But it was possible. Not for them, but for me. The next day, I started making plans for my own life separate from the chaos I'd long carried. I enrolled in a cooking class I'd always wanted to try. Booked a small trip alone. And began saving for a place of my own. For the first time in years, I was prioritizing myself. But as I took these steps, I knew this wasn't just about independence. It was about rewriting a story where I wasn't the invisible caretaker, the wallet, or the scapegoat. It was about reclaiming my voice and standing firm. And yet, even as I built this new life, the past wasn't done with me. The family drama simmered under the surface, threatening to boil over. Late one evening, I received a message that stopped me cold. It was from my sister. But not with anger or blame. Instead, it was a confession. She admitted she'd been scared to lose the security I'd provided. Scared to face the consequences of her own choices. For the first time, she acknowledged her part in the broken family dynamic. It wasn't a peace offering, but it was a start. That message was a crack of light in the darkness. It showed me that beneath the bitterness, beneath the broken trust, there was a chance for something different, maybe even healing. But before anything could change, I had to face the hardest truth. Not everyone wanted to change. Some were comfortable with the status quo, benefiting from my silence and generosity. So, I prepared myself. This journey wasn't just about setting boundaries or demanding respect, it was about standing strong against the tide of denial, entitlement, and neglect. I was ready to fight for my peace. The tension in the family didn't ease, it transformed. My sister's message was unexpected, but it opened a door I didn't know was there. I began to see her in a new light, not just the bratty sibling who always got her way, but someone trapped by fear and expectation. It was a small crack. But cracks let light on. And for the first time, I dared to hope for change. Still, trust was a long road. I stayed cautious, watching how the family reacted to my withdrawal. My mother's proud silence softened to occasional phone calls. Her voice hesitant, unsure whether I'd answer. My father remained distant, a stoic presence who said little but whose eyes spoke volumes. My sister oscillated between guilt and defensiveness, struggling to find balance between old patterns and the emerging reality. Meanwhile, I doubled down on myself. My new job at the nonprofit offered a purpose beyond financial stability. It was about making a difference. Each day, I came home tired but fulfilled. And that fulfillment gave me strength. I started writing again, filling journals with reflections, hopes, and plans. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones who saw me for who I was. Not for what I could provide. But just as I felt the tide turning, the family drama pulled me back in. One afternoon, a package arrived, an anonymous envelope filled with photographs. Pictures from the anniversary party. Candid shots showing my mother and sister whispering, laughing while glancing in my direction. And the event manager's shocked face when I refused to pay the bill. It was a silent message they were still watching. Still judging. It ignited a mix of emotions: hurt, anger, but also resolve. I realized this wasn't just about money or forgotten respect, it was about power and control. For years, I'd been the unspoken backbone, expected to carry burdens silently. Now that I'd stepped away, they sought to shame me, to reel me back into their fold. I shared the photos with Danielle and my uncle. They reminded me to keep clear boundaries, to not engage with provocations. But inside, I wrestled with doubt. Was I overreacting? Was this just family drama? Or a deeper battle for self-worth? That night, I had a vivid memory flash, my mother's smirk as she handed me leftovers at dinner. The coldness in her eyes. The silent dinner table where I sat with plastic forks, invisible to those who claimed to love me. The contrast between their smiles in public and their whispered contempt behind closed doors. I clenched my fists, feeling the old wounds open. But this time I was ready to confront them. The next day, I confronted my sister during a rare phone call. Instead of anger, I spoke calmly, telling her that the past couldn't be erased but the future was ours to shape. I asked if she was willing to face the truth about our family, to own her role and help heal the fractures. Her silence was deafening. She admitted she wasn't sure she could. Fear kept her tethered to the status quo. Afraid of losing the privileges her silence had bought her. I understood. Change is terrifying when it threatens your identity. That conversation marked a turning point. I realized I couldn't force others to change. I could only control my response. My actions. I started focusing on small victories, setting clearer boundaries with my parents. Saying no without guilt. Refusing to cover expenses or fix their problems. Each time I did, the backlash came accusations of betrayal, selfishness, abandoning the family. But I stood firm, fueled by the clarity that self-respect wasn't selfish. Meanwhile, my cousin Danielle became an unexpected ally. She shared stories of her own struggles with family expectations and the pressure to conform. Our conversations became a lifeline, reminding me I wasn't alone in this fight for dignity. But just as I was settling into this new rhythm, an unexpected message arrived, an invitation to a family meeting. The tone was different this time. Less accusatory. More tentative. They wanted to talk. To clear the air. To move forward. Part of me wanted to believe them. To think maybe the family could heal. But I also remembered the past, the broken promises, the hidden contempt. The way I'd been sidelined when it suited them. I agreed to attend. But with conditions. Honesty. Respect. And a commitment to real change. No more illusions. No more silent suffering. The day of the meeting arrived. I walked into the room with cautious hope, aware that this could be a moment of healing or another chapter of disappointment. The faces around the table were familiar. But so were the masks. I decided then that whatever happened, I would no longer be invisible. I would speak my truth, claim my space, and fight for the respect I deserved. Because sometimes, family drama isn't about family, it's about survival. The day of the family meeting arrived with an air thick enough to cut through. As I stepped into the familiar living room, every detail was a sharp reminder of all that had passed the faded wallpaper. The worn couch where I had once been overlooked. The photos of happy times that now felt like a lie. My mother sat poised, her eyes guarded but searching. My sister, more tense than usual, avoided my gaze. My father leaned back, silent, as always, as if watching a play unfold. The conversation began cautiously. Words measured. politeness, masking years of neglect and resentment. My mother spoke first. Her voice steady but strained, apologizing for the misunderstandings, the hurt, the unspoken distance. She said they had been wrong not to acknowledge my contributions, that pride and fear had clouded their judgment. My sister echoed the sentiment, her voice softer, less defensive. I listened, measuring every word, every hesitation. It was easy to say sorry, it was much harder to mean it. I responded not with anger, but with clarity. I told them how invisible I had felt, how their dismissiveness wasn't just a slight, it was a wound that shaped my entire sense of worth. I described the weight of being the financial safety net, the invisible labor no one thanked me for. I revealed the nights spent alone, feeling like a stranger in my own family. They heard me. Or, at least, they said they did. But the true test came when I laid out my conditions for moving forward: respect, honesty, and boundaries. No more assumptions that I would bail them out. No more silencing. No more taking me for granted. My sister looked like she wanted to argue, but something stopped her. My mother nodded slowly, lips pressed tight, perhaps realizing that the family they once controlled was shifting beyond their grasp. Then came the twist: my aunt, who had until now stayed silent, finally spoke up. She revealed that she too had felt sidelined, caught between loyalty to the family and the painful truths we refused to face. Her voice trembled as she admitted that the family's dysfunction had festered too long, poisoning relationships and breeding resentment. That moment cracked open the room. Others chimed in: cousins, even my father, each revealing their own grievances and regrets. What started as a defensive gathering morphed into a raw, honest reckoning. It was uncomfortable, painful, but real. For the first time, we weren't just pretending to be a family. We were confronting the fractures that had always been there, hidden beneath smiles and holiday photos. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of healing. Maybe the walls I'd built to protect myself could slowly come down. But just as the meeting seemed to find its rhythm, a sudden interruption shattered the fragile peace. A text message from my sister, blunt and unfiltered. "We're not ready for this." It read, "Some things are better left buried." The room froze. The weight of her words pulled us back into silence. The tension that had eased flared up anew, darker and more threatening. I realized then that healing wouldn't be a straight path. There would be setbacks, betrayals, moments of doubt. But I also knew I wasn't the same person who had quietly carried their burdens before. I had found my voice, my strength, my boundaries. And I wasn't walking away, not this time. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but with a promise, a fragile, tentative commitment to try, to listen, to respect. As I left that night, the cool air hit my face like a baptism, cleansing the heavy silence I'd carried for so long. I was still standing, still fighting for myself, for the family I wanted to be part of, for the respect I deserved. And the battle wasn't over. In the days that followed, the fragile truce began to show cracks, as old habits and resentments surfaced like ghosts refusing to rest. My sister's text echoed in my mind. The truth we'd barely touched was still a burden none of us were ready to bear. Yet, beneath that tension, something deeper had shifted. The silence that once defined our family was now punctuated by moments of honest, if awkward, communication. My mother called one evening, her voice softer than I remembered. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright but spoke in hesitant fragments, acknowledging that she had failed to see me not just as a provider, but as a person. I didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurances. Instead, I let her words hang, letting her come to terms with the weight of years she had overlooked. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. Meanwhile, my sister kept her distance, caught between loyalty to the family she'd always known and the uncomfortable reality of change. I sensed her struggle, the fear of losing her place in the family dynamic, the unease of facing truths she had long avoided. When we did talk, our conversations were cautious, peppered with memories and tentative hopes. She wasn't ready to fully embrace the shift, but she was no longer trying to block it. I found strength in unexpected places, old friends reaching out with encouragement, strangers sharing stories of their own family struggles online, reminding me I wasn't alone. I started investing more in myself, in things that didn't revolve around repairing what others had broken. Simple pleasures, a morning run, a book that made me laugh, cooking a meal just for me, became acts of reclaiming joy. One afternoon, my uncle, who had remained quietly supportive throughout, invited me over. We sat in his cluttered study, walls lined with books and family photos. He didn't offer easy answers, but he listened. And that listening, that acknowledgement, was balm. He reminded me that families are complicated, layered with love and pain, loyalty and betrayal. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing which stories to carry forward. That night, I drafted a letter not for them, but for myself. A declaration of boundaries and self-respect. A reminder that I was more than the sum of what I'd given. I didn't send it. It was a private vow, a compass to guide me through the uncertain road ahead. But life, as always, had a way of surprising me. At the next family gathering, the atmosphere was tentative but different. My mother greeted me with a genuine smile, her eyes less guarded. My sister approached, hesitated, then gave me a quick hug, small but sincere. Others were quieter, more reflective. No grand declarations, no instant fixes. Just an unspoken recognition that something had changed. I caught my cousin Danielle's eye across the room. She gave me a small nod, the kind that says, "We see you." It wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were moments of tension, glances charged with old grievances, words left unsaid. But beneath it all was the possibility of something new, something real. As I stood there, surrounded by the imperfect people who shared my blood, I realized that family isn't always about harmony or agreement. Sometimes, it's about showing up, being honest, and daring to hope. I took a deep breath and stepped into that hope. Because, after all, the silence, the pain, and the battles, I had found my voice. And that voice wasn't going anywhere. The story isn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I was writing it on my own terms. Story 3. I'm Emily, 32 years old, quietly carrying the weight of a family that never truly saw me. For years, I was the one who paid the bills when money was tight, who fixed leaky roofs, bought groceries without mention, and showed up without complaint. I thought family was unspoken loyalty, invisible sacrifices made without expectation. But then, the day came that shattered every illusion I had built around that word. It was a cold morning in late autumn when I sat in a lawyer's office that smelled of dust and old wood paneling. The light was dim, and a lawyer I'd never met read aloud the contents of my late father's will. My father had passed after a long, painful battle with cancer. My mother, frail and worn, attended remotely from her hospital bed, her face pale but quiet. And my sister Danielle, the golden child, the favorite, was there in person, glowing with an air of entitlement. The lawyer listed the house, the savings, the retirement accounts. Everything was going to Danielle. Not a single word about me. Not a hint, a line, or even a mention. He blinked, waiting for the part where he'd say, "And Emily will receive." But it never came. The silence was a gaping wound I couldn't ignore. Danielle looked at me with a faint, almost rehearsed, pity, as if expecting me to erupt or crumble. But I didn't. I simply sat back and waited for the meeting to end. No one else said a word, not the lawyer, not my mother on the screen. They had made their choice clear. Walking out of that room, I felt something inside me break quietly. No outburst, no tears, just a hollow stillness. That night, I sat in my small apartment, opened my banking app, and started deleting every automatic payment I had set up for them over the years. Internet bill canceled. Electricity canceled. Pharmacy refills canceled. Trash service canceled. Each deletion was a small declaration that I was done being their invisible safety net. I didn't respond to my mother's text that came a month later. Power's about to get shut off. No greeting. No explanation, just that cold notification. I replied with a single word. Then blocked her number. It wasn't anger or bitterness, it was clarity. I was no longer their unpaid caretaker, their invisible daughter. I was free. But that freedom came at the cost of a family who had erased me from their future. I thought I was prepared for the silence that followed. No calls. No texts. No explanations. Danielle continued her life of curated Instagram moments, filled with hashtags about family love and gratitude, as if she carried the whole legacy without a crack. Yet, the house that was once our home began to crumble. The roof leaked. The bills piled up. And the lights flickered more often than they stayed on. One day, a handwritten note arrived at my door. No return address. My name scrawled shakily across the front. Inside, 5 hurried lines on lined paper. We didn't think you'd care. Danielle said you'd be fine. Things are bad. House is falling apart. Power's been off for 3 days. I'm scared. Can you help? Just for a little while. Please. The note wasn't an apology or a plea for forgiveness. It was a desperate SOS, the same family that pushed me away now, scrambling for the one person they deliberately cut out. I sat with it for hours. Not angry. Not sad, just hollow. I folded the note and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened, behind old receipts and forgotten memories. That night, I sat on my balcony, the city lights sparkling below me, and realized that sometimes walking away isn't spite. It's survival. I remembered every time I rushed to their side late-night drives to the hospital. Last-minute bank transfers. Endless chores done without thanks. I'd believed love was quiet sacrifice, steady and unseen. But love without recognition, it's servitude. Years of unspoken labor, unpaid emotional tolls, and invisible efforts, all for a family that erased me from their will and from their lives. And I was done. I had drawn my line in the sand. Not with anger, but with an unshakable resolve. Let them sit in the house I once kept from falling apart. Let them feel the cold and the dark when the help doesn't come. Because this time, I wasn't stepping back in. Weeks later, the silence grew into a calm I hadn't known in years. No guilt trips. No frantic messages. No halfway apologies. The bridge wasn't burned. It was never built. I began to crave this clean break, the absence of chaos. The freedom to breathe without the weight of their demands. One quiet morning, as the sun streamed through my apartment window, I found peace in the space I'd carved out for myself, a life that didn't revolve around saving a family who refused to be saved. The lights were on in my own world now. But freedom has its own price. When I saw my mother's car pull into my driveway unannounced, with Danielle silently sitting beside her, I felt the old wounds stir. They showed up, hoping to erase the silence with presence, thinking a visit could rewrite years of neglect. I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. I just turned away, closed the garage, and let the moment pass quietly into the night. No forgiveness offered. No explanations asked. Just a stillness that spoke louder than any words could. The stars twinkled overhead as I sat on my porch, drink in hand, reflecting on what I'd given and what was returned. They had made their choice. I had made mine. And, unlike them, I was sticking to it. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unappreciated, remember, sometimes survival means walking away. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing you'll ever do. After that quiet night on the porch, life settled into a new rhythm, one where I no longer checked my phone for messages from my family. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was a space I filled with calm, with moments I could call mine. But just as I began to breathe, the past crept back, uninvited and raw. It started with a subtle shift in my neighborhood. I began noticing the blue SUV parked near my parents' old house more frequently, Danielle's car. Unmistakable. She moved with the same polished grace she always had, laughing on the phone, as if the chaos unraveling inside those walls wasn't hers to bear. One afternoon, I saw her chatting casually with someone I didn't recognize, sunglasses hiding her eyes, her smile easy, unburdened. The disconnect stung. Here I was, the one who'd silently held everything together. And she was the one who inherited the legacy, but without the weight of responsibility. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I just watched from a distance, feeling like a ghost in a life I once helped build. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pulled me to check the county's public utility records one evening. I didn't expect to find anything. Just a fleeting thought to see if the house was still standing under Danielle's care. The screen lit up with stark facts: a final notice on the electric bill. The due date had passed. Shut off pending. That final notice hit like a punch. The house was crumbling, and the lights were going dark. The perfect Instagram post didn't pay the bills. The hollow words about family and love hadn't kept the roof from leaking or the power from cutting out, this asked. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. This was the truth behind the curated smiles and well-crafted social media stories, a legacy unraveling under the weight of neglect. The next morning, I was in my garage, tightening a shelf bracket I'd been meaning to fix for weeks. The sunlight spilled through the windows, birds chirping a gentle melody. It was a day begging for peace. Then, the unexpected happened. A car pulled up into my driveway, not Danielle's, but Mom's old sedan, the one I hadn't seen in years. It rattled softly as it came to a stop. Mom stepped out slowly, wearing oversized sunglasses that seemed to hide not just her eyes but her spirit. Her clothes were neat but worn, and she looked smaller, dimmer, like someone had unplugged the vibrant woman I used to know and left a fragile shell behind. In the passenger seat was Danielle. She didn't get out. I stood there in the driveway, wrench still in my hand, frozen in place. No welcome. No anger. Just a quiet moment, heavy with unspoken words. Mom glanced my way, searching for an opening, a sign, a reason to start the conversation. But I gave her none. Without a word, I turned and walked inside, closing the garage door with a soft finality. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just the silence that had defined our fractured relationship. Minutes later, I peeked through the front window. The car was gone. No note. No knock. No explanation. No sign that anything had changed because nothing had. That night, I sat alone on my porch, a cold drink in hand, staring up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky. My mind wandered through every memory: the late-night hospital runs, the emergency bank transfers, the countless small acts of love that went unnoticed. I realized something profound. Love without recognition isn't love, it's servitude. Years of invisible labor, unappreciated sacrifice, all for a family that erased me from their future. The truth was clear: I had been invisible, not because I was weak, but because I was taken for granted. I made my choice that night. I would no longer be the unpaid caretaker, the silent sufferer. Let them sit in the cold, in the dark, in the house I helped keep from falling apart. Let them live the consequences of their absence. Because this time, I was done stepping back in. Days turned to weeks. And the silence that followed was not painful, it was healing. No guilt trips. No frantic calls. No apologies, thinly veiled in excuses. The bridge between us wasn't burned, it was never built. I embraced the quiet, the peace, the space to breathe and finally live for myself. But the peace came with its own weight. A month after their silent departure from my life, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. My name written in shaky handwriting. Inside, a hastily scrawled note: "We didn't think you'd care. Danielle said you'd be fine. Things are bad. House is falling apart. Power's been off for 3 days. I'm scared. Can you help? Just for a little while. Please." It wasn't an apology. It was a distress signal. A plea from people who never valued me until they needed me. I sat with it for a long time. Not angry. Not sad, just hollow. Because I realized they hadn't learned anything. Not really. I folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. Then tucked it away in a drawer full of forgotten things. Later, I poured myself a cup of tea, wrapped a sweater tight, and sat on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the cityscape. I didn't respond, because I had already said all I needed to say through my silence, my absence, and my refusal to be erased any longer. Sometimes walking away isn't spite. It's survival. The days that followed were a strange blend of quiet and chaos. The silence from my family was almost deafening. But inside that silence was a brewing storm I was preparing to face head-on. The note left in my mailbox was a crack in the wall. A crack that whispered of desperation. Yet no remorse. It was a call for help from people who had long since closed the door on me. I spent that week going over every detail, every memory, every moment I had poured into a family that never truly saw me. Each unpaid bill I'd covered, every emergency call I'd made, every ounce of energy I'd given felt like a ghost haunting my thoughts. The weight of it all pressed down. But instead of breaking me, it steeled my resolve. That Saturday morning, the air was crisp and the city was waking up slowly. I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I started drafting an email, not angry, not pleading, just cold, precise, and final. It detailed every expense I'd covered for them in the past year: utilities, groceries, repairs, even medical bills. Each line was backed with receipts, bank statements, and time-stamped texts, irrefutable proof of my quiet sacrifices. I sent it to their emails, CCing my lawyer. This wasn't a demand for repayment, it was a clear message I was done giving. The reply was swift, but not what I expected. My sister's response was laced with venom disguised as concern. She called me selfish, reckless, and accused me of trying to shame her publicly. My mother's message was dripping with guilt trips, desperately trying to reel me back, telling me I was hurting the family, that forgiveness was the only path forward. My father remained silent, the ghost in the background, neither condemning nor supporting. But his absence was as loud as any accusation. I didn't engage. The flood of texts and calls kept coming, each one more frantic, more disparate. But I stayed silent. I let the storm rage without me. One evening, the weight of their absence was momentarily shattered by a surprise visit from my neighbor, Jake, a kind man in his 40s who'd watched the family drama unfold from his corner house. He brought over a small care package, some homemade bread, and a warm smile. We sat on my porch, the city lights flickering around us. And for the first time in months, I felt understood without words. Jake didn't ask for details. He just said, "You deserve better than being invisible to your own family." That simple validation was a balm, reminding me I wasn't alone. Even when it felt like I was fighting a battle no one saw. Meanwhile, the house was slowly slipping through my family's fingers. Public records showed unpaid taxes piling up, contractors leaving half-finished repairs, and neighbors whispering about the place falling into disrepair. The facade of perfect family life crumbled alongside the foundation of that old house. Every new bill posted was a quiet victory for me. They had the legacy, but they didn't have the stability I'd tried so hard to secure. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, it was justice measured in cold, unyielding facts. Then came the call that changed everything. I was at work when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Didnt, I answered. Hello. Is this Emily Harris? Yes. Who's this? This is Sarah, your sister's lawyer. Danielle's had some difficulties. She's asking to talk. My heart twisted in ways I hadn't expected. After months of silence, suddenly, the world felt unsteady again. I didn't know if it was anger, pity, or simply the weight of unresolved history pressing down. I told Sarah I'd call back. That night, as the city lights dimmed and the world fell quiet, I stared at my phone, debating what to do. Could I trust her? Was I ready to reopen doors I'd shut so firmly? The familiar ache of betrayal mingled with the possibility of reconciliation, but only on my terms. I made a decision. I would listen. Not to forgive. Not to forget. But to finally understand what had broken us all. The next few days unfolded like a careful dance of tension and uncertainty. I called Sarah back. Our conversation polite but guarded. Danielle was struggling financially and emotionally. She wasn't ready to apologize. Not yet. But she wanted to explain. I agreed to meet, but on neutral ground. where no one could wield past grievances like weapons. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. A place where the hum of other lives created a buffer from the weight of our history. Daniele arrived first. Her face a mask of tiredness and vulnerability. The vibrant, confident woman I once knew had faded into someone quieter, more fragile. It was hard to reconcile this Danielle with the one who had inherited everything without a glance my way. She started hesitantly, fumbling with her coffee cup. "I never meant to push you away," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I was scared, overwhelmed. I didn't know how to ask for help. Her confession cracked open something in me, the anger, the hurt revealing a sliver of empathy. But years of silence and disregard weren't erased by a single meeting. I listened, demanding honesty and accountability. Danielle admitted that the weight of inheritance was heavier than she expected. The bills, the repairs, the pressure of keeping up appearances, it all crushed her. She'd turned to old habits, avoidance, social media facades, and running away whenever things got hard. I was lost, she confessed, eyes glistening. I saw her not as a rival anymore, but as a mirror reflecting my own scars, the loneliness of being unseen, the pain of unmet expectations. Yet, I knew I had to protect myself too. Forgiveness wouldn't be handed out lightly. It had to be earned. The conversation turned to practicalities. Danielle asked if I could help with the bills again. But this time on her terms, a plan with boundaries, clear responsibilities. I agreed, cautiously. It wasn't about charity anymore. It was about setting terms for respect and cooperation. That night, I lay awake thinking about how thin the line between family and strangers had become. How easy it was to fall into patterns of neglect and misunderstanding. I resolved to rewrite the script, not to erase the past, but to build a future where I was no longer invisible. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents remained frozen in awkward silence. My mother's health deteriorated slowly, the hospital visits more frequent. Despite everything, I was there, not out of obligation, but because deep down, love still tethered me. One rainy afternoon, as I sat beside my mother's hospital bed, she reached out, grasping my hand weakly. Her eyes searched mine, unspoken apologies and regrets, swimming in their depths. It was a fragile moment, one that held the promise of healing if we dared to take it. But healing was a slow, uneven road. My father remained distant, retreating into silence, unwilling to face the fractures he helped create. The family's foundation was cracked, but not yet broken. Back at my apartment, I doubled down on my work, channeling the emotional turbulence into progress. My business was growing steadily, the recognition finally arriving. But success felt bittersweet, a reminder of what I'd sacrificed and the battles I'd fought to claim my place. A surprise invitation came from a local business awards gala. They wanted to honor me as an emerging entrepreneur. As I stood on the stage, accepting the applause, I thought about how far I'd come from the shadows of family neglect to the spotlight of my own making. Yet, even in that moment of triumph, I carried the quiet scars of those who had refused to see me. The applause was mine alone, and it echoed louder because it was earned without their approval. Just as I was settling into this new chapter, a sudden twist emerged. An unexpected phone call from a distant relative I barely knew. She claimed to have information that could change everything about our family's history. Secrets that had been buried long before any of us were born. The news promised to unravel long-held assumptions and force us all to confront truths we'd avoided. It was the kind of revelation that could shatter what little peace remained or open the door to genuine reconciliation. As I hung up, heart pounding, I realized this was not just a story about inheritance or betrayal anymore. It was about the hidden wounds families carry and the strength it takes to face them. The call from my distant cousin, Laura, sent a ripple through the fragile peace I'd been building. She wasn't just a casual relative, she carried stories older than any of us imagined. Stories that could rewrite the entire family narrative. I sat down with a mix of curiosity and dread, knowing that some truths once unearthed could either heal or devastate. Laura's voice was steady but urgent as she recounted what she had discovered: decades-old letters and documents hidden away, revealing betrayals and sacrifices, secrets about my parents' past and the tangled web of decisions that led to the fractured family we knew. The inheritance dispute, the cold shoulder, the silent exclusions. They weren't isolated incidents, but pieces of a much larger puzzle. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, realizing that my story was part of a legacy much darker and more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Determined to uncover the full truth, I arranged to meet Laura the following weekend at her home in the suburbs. The house was cozy, filled with old photographs and heirlooms, echoes of a family history that had been carefully concealed. As she laid out the letters, each one painted a vivid picture of struggles, sacrifices, and betrayals that explained some of the coldness and secrecy in my own family. It was like reading a story of survival disguised as silence, of love twisted by fear and pride. The most shocking revelation was about a long-ago agreement. My parents had made a pact that prioritized appearances and social standing over genuine connection and support. It became clear how my sister, Danielle, was raised to be the golden child, groomed to maintain the family's public image, while others, like me, were quietly pushed aside. I spent hours absorbing this new perspective, grappling with a mix of sorrow and understanding. My anger softened, replaced by a deeper empathy for the complex people behind the hurt. But the truth also ignited a fire within me, a resolve to break this cycle of silence and neglect. Back home, I drafted a letter to my parents, not to accuse, but to invite openness. I wanted to bridge the gap between us, to create a space where honesty could finally thrive. The letter was raw and heartfelt, a vulnerable confession of my pain and my hope for healing. Weeks passed without a reply, the silence stretching like a chasm. But then, unexpectedly, my mother reached out. Her voice trembled over the phone as she apologized for the past, for the pain and distance. She spoke of regret and the desire to rebuild what was lost, of wanting to be part of my life again. It was the first time she had truly acknowledged the wounds between us. We started meeting regularly, cautiously at first, navigating the fragile terrain of forgiveness and understanding. My father remained distant, his pride a barrier I wasn't ready to confront yet. Danielle's presence was sporadic, but even she seemed changed, humbled by the revelations and the consequences of her earlier choices. Meanwhile, my business flourished. I hired a small team, turning my backyard projects into a legitimate company. Each success was a testament not only to my skills but to my resilience, a triumph over years of being unseen and underestimated. One crisp autumn evening, at a community event celebrating local entrepreneurs, I was invited to share my story. Standing before a crowd, I spoke not just of business but of family, pain, and the courage to stand up for oneself. The applause was thunderous. But what touched me most was the flood of messages afterward, people who saw their own struggles in my story, who felt less alone, As I left the stage, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Laura, hinting that there were still more secrets to uncover, more family ties to explore. I smiled, knowing the journey was far from over. But for the first time, I felt ready. The past had shaped me, but it would not define me. I was no longer the invisible daughter, the forgotten sibling. I was a woman who had claimed her story, faced her demons, and forged a future on her own terms. And as I looked out over the city skyline from my office window, I knew this was just the beginning.